Good afternoon. I'm Jenny Beth Martin with Tea Party Patriots Action. Welcome to this week's Lunch Break Live with Tea Party Patriots. In just a moment, we'll go to Bill Pasco for our Washington Report. Before we do that, take a moment to share this Facebook Live or YouTube or Rumble or however you're watching it session with your friends and make sure they know so they can get the latest report from Washington. And then if you have any questions during the Washington Report, feel free to email me at jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. Again, that's jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. And now we're going to Bill Pasco for our Washington Report.
Thank you, Jenny Beth. The House and Senate will return Tuesday and stay in session through Friday. Last week in the House came back on Monday and voted to pass two bills under suspension of the rules. On Tuesday, the House voted to pass another bill under suspension and then passed a rule. Then the House took up H.R. 6192, the Hands Off Our Home Appliances Act. The House voted to amend the bill and then voted to pass the bill. Then the House took up H.J. Res. 98, a Congressional Review Act resolution of disapproval against the rules submitted by the National Labor Relations Board regarding standards for determining joint employer status. The measure failed. Then the House passed another bill under suspension of the rules. On Wednesday, the House voted to pass a bill under suspension of the rules, and then the House voted to table Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene's motion to vacate the speakership, that is, to oust Speaker Mike Johnson from his job. The motion was tabled. Then the House took up and passed H.J. Res. 109, a Congressional Review Act resolution of disapproval against the rules submitted by the Securities and Exchange Commission relating to Staff Accounting Bulletin Number 121. Then the House took up and passed H.R. 2925, the Mining Regulatory Clarity Act, and H.R. 7109, the Equal Representation Act. Then the House took up and passed two more bills under suspension of the rules, and then they were done. This week in the House will return Tuesday with the first vote set for 6:30 p.m. At that time, the House is scheduled to consider 17 bills under suspension of the rules, including the Federal Aviation Administration reauthorization that passed the Senate last week. It's Police Week in the House this week, so on Wednesday and for the remainder of the week, the House will consider the following legislation under a rule. H.R. 354, the Leosa Reform Act. H.R. 7343, the Detain and Deport Illegal Aliens Who Assault Cops Act. H.R. 8146, the Police Our Border Act. H.Res. 1213, a resolution regarding violence against law enforcement officers. H.Res. 1210, condemning the Biden border crisis and the tremendous burden law enforcement officers face as a result. H.R. 7581, Improving Law Enforcement Officer Safety and Wellness Through Data Act. And H.R. 7530, the D.C. Crimes Act of 2024. And then finally, the House will also take up an as yet unnumbered bill called the Israel Security Assistance Support Act, offered by House Appropriations Defense Subcommittee Chair Ken Calvert, along with Appropriations Chair Tom Cole, State and Foreign Operations Subcommittee Chair Mario Diaz-Balart, and Financial Services and General Government Subcommittee Chair David Joyce. The legislation would curb the president's efforts to withhold security resources appropriated by U.S. law, compelling the delivery of defense weapons to Israel as Israel fights to protect itself from radical Islamic terrorists. Last week in the Senate returned on Tuesday and voted to confirm Donna Ann Welton to be United States Ambassador to the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste. On Wednesday, the Senate rejected an attempt to table the Federal Aviation Administration reauthorization. On Thursday, the Senate came to agreement that there would be no amendments considered on the FAA reauthorization bill. So at 1 p.m., the Senate voted to invoke cloture on the bill, and then 5 hours later, the Senate voted to pass the bill, and then they were done. This week in the Senate will return Tuesday with the first vote set for 5:30 p.m. At that time, the Senate will proceed to a roll call vote to invoke cloture on the nomination of Courtney Diesel O'Donnell to be United States Permanent Representative to the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Then, based on the majority leader's cloture filings, I imagine we'll also see action on the nominations of Jayshuk Bulsara to be a district judge for the Eastern District of New York, and Seth Robert Aframe to be a circuit judge for the First Circuit Court of Appeals. Now let's talk about Biden's tax hike. Even though it was introduced 2 months ago, President Biden's budget proposal for fiscal year 2025 hasn't gotten a great deal of attention. That's probably good for him because it reveals his priorities. One of those priorities that was brought to my attention last week by our good friends at Americans for Tax Reform is Biden's proposal for an increase in the capital gains tax rate. Biden wants to raise that tax and the tax on qualified dividends to 44.6%. That would make the capital gains tax rate higher than it's ever been since its introduction more than a century ago. Worse, when you combine it with state tax rates, it means that in some states you'd pay more than 50% on your capital gains, and that's just wrong. And remember, capital gains taxes are not indexed for inflation. So when you hold a stock or an investment for some time and then sell it, and you realize a gain, a large part of that gain might be simply a paper gain because of inflation. But you're still required to pay taxes on it. Biden and people who think like him don't understand how capital gains work. They think the only people who realize capital gains are rich and can afford to pay exorbitant rates. That's just wrong. Now let's talk about the border crisis. The Biden administration has finally noticed that people are upset about its handling of the crisis on the southern border. Consequently, the administration announced last Thursday that it's making changes to asylum policy. Not, mind you, because the Biden administration is really interested in doing anything to stop the flow of millions of illegal aliens across the southern border, but because they're interested in appearing to take the border crisis seriously for political reasons. So on Thursday, the Department of Homeland Security announced that it would put in place a new rule regarding immigrants with criminal histories and/or links to terrorism. Under current practice, such problems don't show up until an asylum applicant's immigration hearing, which can be years after he or she arrives at the border and moves into the interior of the country. Under the new rule, DHS says its frontline officers will be able to ask questions much earlier in the process, within just days of the applicant's arrival. Of course, that should have been the practice all along. People with criminal histories and links to terrorism have no business applying for or being granted asylum in the United States. But it's a very small group of people we're talking about, so this is not going to make a dent in the problem. The new rule will go into effect after a 30-day comment period. Now let's talk about the Iran envoy. You'll recall that a little over a year ago, the Biden administration's Iran envoy, Robert Malley, had his security clearance lifted by the State Department's Diplomatic Security Service as he was placed on leave from his duties as Biden's top man on Iran. He eventually realized the leave was going to last longer than he had hoped, and he took a position teaching at Princeton and at Yale. And since then, we've been left in the dark as to what happened there. Last Monday, Senator Jim Risch, the top-ranking Senate Republican on the Foreign Relations Committee, and Congressman Michael McCaul, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, wrote a letter to Secretary of State Antony Blinken criticizing state for its lack of transparency on the issue and asking for confirmation of information they had gathered from other sources, to wit, that Malley had been suspended because, quote, he allegedly transferred classified documents to his personal email account and downloaded these documents to his personal cell phone, end quote. The letter further asks Blinken to confirm their belief that, quote, a hostile cyber actor was able to gain access to his email and/or phone and obtain the downloaded information, end quote. The letter goes on, quote, when and how did the cyber actor compromise Mr. Malley's account? Did the compromise of Mr. Malley's device enable subsequent compromise of other senior officials at the State Department, National Security Council, or other agencies? How did the malign cyber actor utilize the information obtained from Mr. Malley? End quote. As of this writing, the State Department has not yet responded. Now let's talk about Merrick Garland's contempt of Congress. This coming Thursday, just a few days from now, the House Judiciary Committee will vote to declare Attorney General Merrick Garland in contempt of Congress for his refusal to turn over to the committee the audio recording of Special Counsel Robert Hur's interview with President Biden. The committee asked for and received the full transcript of the interview months ago, but the committee asked for the actual audio recording because the members of the committee know that tone, pacing, inflection, emphasis, and other verbal cues can change meanings, and these cannot be picked up properly in only a written transcript of an interview. Attorney General Garland takes the position that he doesn't have to respond to the request from the Judiciary Committee. Former Trump White House officials Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro thought the same thing about the congressional subpoenas they received and were convicted and sentenced to prison for it. We'll see what happens to Garland, but I'm pretty sure of at least one thing. Given that the person who would have to prosecute Garland for contempt of Congress is a United States attorney who responds directly to the office of the Attorney General, I think it's highly unlikely Garland will be prosecuted. Now let's talk about the latest on the Biden impeachment. On Friday, freshman Republican Congressman Cory Mills of Florida introduced an article of impeachment against President Biden for threatening to withhold aid and ammunition from Israel in its attempt to block a full-scale invasion of Rafah. Mills told Fox News, quote, President Biden abused the powers of his office by soliciting a quid pro quo with Israel, while leveraging vital military aid for policy changes. This egregious action not only compromised the credibility of the United States, but also undermined the interest of our longstanding ally, end quote. Regardless of what Biden may or may not have said privately to Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, on Wednesday, Biden publicly threatened Israel. During an interview on CNN, he said he would hold up certain forms of ammunition if Israel carries out a full-scale invasion of the city in southern Gaza. Netanyahu responded by saying Israel would fight with its fingernails if necessary. Last week, the U.S. paused bomb shipments to Israel. On Thursday, Israel's war cabinet voted to expand the scope of the operation in Rafah. Speaker Johnson was upset when he heard about Biden's move. In a long interview with Politico, he said he had heard the previous night about Biden's move to pause the delivery of certain weapons to Israel. Quote, and my reaction, honestly, was, wow, that is a complete turn from what I've been told even in, recent hours. I mean, 24 hours ago, it was confirmed to me by top administration officials that the policy is very different than what he stated there. So I hope that's a senior moment. Johnson continued, I was in the skiff having classified discussions with some top administration officials. My concern was we got word about these, this shipment of munitions being delayed. And that was a great concern to us because I got commitments from top administration officials before we passed the supplemental package for the aid to Israel that would not happen, end quote. The speaker said he had been told, quote, in writing and verbally, unquote, that there was, quote, no delay in the delivery of weapons to Israel because it's so desperately needed, end quote. Johnson was not satisfied, so he called Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu directly. Quote, so yesterday I talked with Prime Minister Netanyahu about it, and I wanted to get confirmation from him exactly what's happening. And he described exactly what was happening before the news was confirmed, Johnson said. I went straight to the White House and I said, what gives? Somebody's going to have to explain this to me because it's very different than what I was told. He was told, he says, that the aid was paused, that the aid that was paused was from an earlier tranche of assistance and had nothing to do with the supplemental package that had just been passed. The confusion around the issue made Biden's comments on CNN even more surprising, Politico said. Quote, I believe he's off script, Johnson said. I don't think that's something that staff told him to say. I hope it's a senior moment, because that would be a great deviation in what is said to be the policy there, end quote. Stay tuned. This one is not going away. Now to the latest on non-citizen voting. On Wednesday morning of last week, Speaker Johnson and Texas Republican Congressman Chip Roy Along with Tea Party Patriots Action Honorary Chairman Jenny Beth Martin and a half dozen other conservative grassroots leaders held a press conference to introduce and support the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. The bill amends the National Voter Registration Act, also known as the Motor Voter Law, to require states to obtain documentary proof of citizenship before registering someone to vote. Utah Republican Senator Mike Lee, who also attended the press conference, posted to his X account, and I'm going to read a long excerpt because it's really the best thing I've seen yet to explain why this legislation is important. Quote, congressional Democrats insist that the SAVE Act, which requires proof of citizenship to establish eligibility to vote in federal elections, is unnecessary because federal law, 18 U.S.C. 611, already prohibits non-citizens from voting in federal elections. Those making this argument ignore a glaring problem. The government officials who register voters and conduct federal elections aren't allowed to require proof of citizenship. It's therefore shockingly easy for non-citizens to vote in federal elections, leaving our elections dangerously vulnerable to illegal immigrants who might register to vote in federal elections just by checking a box and signing a form. This is all on the honor system. No proof of citizenship is required. It's not just that state officials who are responsible for federal voter registration and elections in our country don't verify citizenship in this context. It's that the Supreme Court has told them they're not allowed to do so. End quote. Now to the latest on anti-Trump lawfare. All I'm going to say about the Manhattan court trial is, what a show. Last week, the prosecutors brought to the stand a former porn star who, after having denied for years that she ever had a sexual relationship with former President Trump, changed her mind and her story, and has been claiming for the last 8 years that she did have a sexual encounter with Trump. She also claimed for years that it was consensual, that she was not a victim, not part of the Me Too brigade, and apparently changed her mind on that too. She testified in excruciating detail about the particulars of the encounter, details with which I shall not bore you. But here's the thing. For purposes of this trial, her testimony was irrelevant. This trial is not about whether or not Donald Trump had a sexual encounter with a woman 18 years ago. It's not a trial about whether he forced himself on her or not. It is not a trial about whether or not he paid for her silence. It is a trial about whether or not he caused false bookkeeping entries to be made in the ledgers of his company for fraudulent purposes. She knows absolutely nothing about that. She's not an accountant. She didn't see the books. She didn't even invoice the Trump Organization. She had absolutely no evidence of value to add to the proceedings. So what was she doing there? She was there to embarrass the former president, that's all. Worse, the judge allowed the entry into evidence of information that even he later admitted he regretted, claims that may well turn out to be the cause of the overturning of a guilty verdict if one arrives. Just last week, Harvey Weinstein's conviction was overturned on appeal for this very reason. This week, the prosecutors will put on the stand a convicted perjurer, Michael Cohen. Elsewhere, in Georgia, the Court of Appeals will now review the judge's decision to allow Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis to remain in her position prosecuting the case against Trump. And in the Florida documents case, Judge Cannon has put an indefinite hold on the proceedings. Stay tuned. And now to the Jenny Beth Show. Episode 65 of the Jenny Beth Show dropped on Wednesday. The episode features Jenny Beth's conversation with Phil Kerpen, who runs American Commitment, and who, along with Steve Forbes, Art Laffer, and Stephen Moore, formed the Committee to Unleash Prosperity. As always, the conversation is both interesting and educational. Highly recommended. And that's our Washington Report for this week.
Bill, thank you so much for that Washington Report. And if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email at jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. This week, for our call to action, we have a few. You can go to our homepage at teapartypatriots.org to see those. The things that we want you to be thinking about doing for calls to action are to volunteer to be a poll watcher or a poll worker. to help secure elections, and also consider how you can work to get out the vote so that we can win elections. And then finally, we're working on a citizens-only voting bill. I spoke at a press conference last week with Speaker Mike Johnson, Congressman Chip Roy, and Senator Mike Lee, working to introduce the SAVE Act, the Safeguarding American Voter Eligibility Act. And I encourage you to take action on that by filling out our petition and our Align Act on it, and then calling your member of Congress, whether it's a Republican or Democrat, both your congressman and both senators, and urging them to pass the SAVE Act. And if you have any questions about the SAVE Act or our call to action or the Washington Report, feel free to shoot me an email at jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org, and we will see you next week with Lunch Break Live with Tea Party Patriots.